I remember the moment the sky cracked. 1 second, the horizon was a dull gray. The next it was a bleeding orange, molten rivers carving the clouds as if the world itself had torn open. The air smelled of sulfur and iron, thick enough to taste. I coughed, hacking violently, my lungs rejecting the first sip of the poisoned wind. I had no idea then that I would survive, or if surviving would even matter. I ran because there was nothing else left to do. Behind me, the town was a ruin of twisting steel and fire. The eruption wasn't sudden. The warnings had been ignored, buried under political speeches and fake assurances. But no words could shield anyone from the fury of a mountain that had been sleeping for centuries. Now it was awake and it wanted to reclaim the earth. I had no choice but to run toward it. Ash fell like black snow, sticking to my clothes, my hair, clogging my throat. Every step I took sank me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The streets were deserted. Those who hadn't fled had been claimed by the firestorms or suffocated by the thickening smoke. I swallowed bile and pushed onward, toward a ridge that I hoped would lead away from the worst of it. And then I saw the wilds. I had read about the Ashfall Wilds in old, dusty survival guides, passed down like a curse. A volcanic badland where the earth breathed fire, rivers of molten rock carved the land into grotesque shapes, and the wind carried not just ash but the remnants of those foolish enough to enter. Legends spoke of creatures that had evolved in these infernal conditions, predators that didn't need eyes, that hunted by sensing the very heartbeat of prey. I had laughed at such tales once. Now, as I stepped past the last safe ridge and into the ashen expanse, laughter was impossible. The sky was a constant orange glow, the ash storm casting shadows that shifted like living things. The ground hissed with every step, a molten river nearby spilling light that danced across the ash in eerie patterns. I felt the first real flicker of fear. Not the abstract terror of falling mountains, but something more personal, more intimate. I was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. I tried to move quietly, though quiet was impossible. Every step was met with the groan of the unstable terrain. Ash clung to my boots, heat radiated from fissures that gaped open like yawning mouths, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. My heart thumped in my chest, but in this place, that sound wasn't mine alone. Something else listened. I caught it first as a shift in the air. Something moved in the distance, but it didn't cast a shadow in the ashlit gloom. My pulse spiked. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I had to remember everything I had learned about survival, about patience, about fear. This wasn't a place for rashness. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thump, like a drum echoing inside the ground itself. Not the beat of my own heart, but another. Something was out there, sensing me, hunting me, learning the rhythm of my pulse. I froze, forcing my chest to slow, though the terror made my veins hum with adrenaline. The creature emerged as if from smoke itself. Its body was tall, thin, almost skeletal, with heat-warped skin that reflected the fiery landscape like a living mirror. It had no eyes, or perhaps eyes hidden beneath folds of hardened flesh, but I knew it saw me. I could feel it, a predator that could detect the very essence of life. I ran, not toward safety. I didn't know where safety was, but away from it, toward any hollow in the land, any shadow I could call temporary refuge. The ground trembled with every step, fissures cracking beneath me, hot steam spraying from unseen vents. The Ashfall Wilds didn't just threaten life. They reshaped it, and I was just another piece of flammable material thrown into its furnace. As I ducked behind a jagged rock formation, trying to catch my breath, I realized something chilling. The wilds weren't just dangerous. They were alive. The land itself seemed to watch me, the ash storm whispering secrets I couldn't hear, the lava glinting like the eyes of something ancient. I had escaped the eruption, but the real nightmare had only just begun, and I was still being hunted. I didn't dare look back. Not yet. My lungs burned as I forced my legs to push me further into the shifting landscape of the Ashfall Wilds. The creature's heartbeat, no presence, still echoed in the air. Every gust of wind, every crack in the earth sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder that I was not alone. I crouched low behind the jagged rock formation, not daring to make a sound. The distant rumble of lava rivers provided a constant backdrop, but I could still hear the steady thump, thump, thump of something nearby, like a predator waiting for me to make a wrong move. It wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent, patient. I could feel its awareness, its hunger. The ground beneath me shifted again, and a low growl, like an echo from the earth, itself vibrated through my bones. Something in the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't tell if the heat from the volcano or the weight of my fear was making it harder to breathe. I pressed myself further into the stone, my hands scraping against the jagged surface. I needed to move. I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what that creature was, but I knew it wasn't the only thing out there. The Ashfall Wilds were full of them. I had read about it in the old survival guides, the things that hunted by sound, by heat, by the pulse of life. They were the true masters of this land, and I was nothing but an intruder in their world. I had to keep moving. The land around me was a nightmare of twisted rock formations and ever-moving ash. Every time I looked around, the landscape seemed to change. The ground was alive, shifting like liquid rock. Steaming vents sprayed bursts of scalding gas into the air, and in the distance, a river of lava carved its way through the Badlands, glowing like a demonic serpent. But I couldn't stay put. I could feel the heat drawing closer, the presence of the creature creeping nearer. If I stayed too long, it would find me, and whatever it was, I didn't want to find out how it hunted. I forced myself up, taking slow, deliberate steps. Each one seemed to sink further into the ashen soil, my boots leaving deep impressions. The weight of the ash on my shoulders was suffocating. I moved quietly, quieter than I thought possible in this hellish place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was watching me, listening to my every move. Suddenly, a sound split the silence. A sharp, scraping noise, like claws dragging against rock. My blood froze. I turned, instinctively reaching for the knife at my waist. There, at the edge of the shadowed rock formation, I saw it, another creature, but this one was different. It wasn't the same sleek, skeletal figure I had seen earlier. This one was massive, almost hulking in its size, with dark, twisted limbs that ended in claws sharp enough to tear through steel. Its skin was burned and cracked, like the surface of the land itself, but it moved with a slow, predatory grace. Its head snapped toward me, and I froze. There was no mistaking it. The creature saw me. I could feel its gaze like a weight on my chest, its senses honed by years, centuries, of surviving in this infernal hellscape. The thing didn't need to approach me. It was already closing in, its presence wrapping around me like smoke. But I didn't have time to run. The ground shifted beneath me, and I stumbled, my foot catching on a jagged rock. I gasped, barely keeping my balance. In that split second, I saw the creature's mouth, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, as if it had been designed to shred and consume. But it wasn't just a physical predator. It was something more, something ancient. The air thickened with a sense of dread. I realized that it didn't need to see me. It could feel my pulse. That's when I heard it. A soft, resonating hum that vibrated through the air. Something deep in the earth, something alive. The creature paused, its head tilting, listening to something I couldn't hear. I didn't wait. I didn't want to wait. I ran. My feet pounded against the ash-covered ground, slipping and sliding as I fought to stay upright. Behind me, the creature didn't move right away. For a moment, I thought I had gotten away, until the ground trembled. A fissure cracked open beneath me. The earth split with a sickening sound, and hot steam shot up in a geyser, scalding my legs as I stumbled to avoid it. But I wasn't quick enough. My left foot caught, and I felt the heat burn through my boot. I screamed, jerking back, but the pain was instant, searing. I ripped my foot out of the ground, only to see it blistering red beneath my torn pants. The skin was already bubbling. I didn't have time to think about it. I pushed forward, ignoring the pain, focusing only on the darkness ahead. I could hear the creature now, its claws scraping over rock, its breath a low hiss in the air. It was getting closer. There was no way I could outrun it. Not with a burned leg, Not in this wasteland. My options were dwindling fast, and I had no plan, no survival instinct that would keep me alive here. All I had was the primal fear that was driving me forward, telling me to move, to keep moving, no matter what. Then something changed in the air. The wind shifted, the temperature dropped just a fraction. Just enough to make me stop, just enough to freeze my blood in my veins. I felt the presence before I saw it. It was a shadow, but it wasn't just any shadow. It was a living shadow, something that moved with unnatural fluidity. The creature behind me hesitated, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't the only predator in these wilds. The other, whatever it was now circling me. A silent phantom that had emerged from the very ground I was standing on. It was a game of cat and mouse. Only this time I wasn't sure who the cat was. I barely had time to catch my breath before the world around me twisted. The shadow didn't stay still. It moved, gliding through the smoke and ash like a living thing. Something that belonged here in the cursed, burned landscape of the Ashfall Wilds. My pulse hammered in my ears as I tried to focus, my injured leg dragging, the searing pain from the burn intensifying with each agonizing step. The wind whispered, no, screeched, a high-pitched sound that felt like a warning. The shadows shifted again, coalescing into a shape just beyond the reach of the flames and molten rivers that streaked across the land. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body black as pitch, its limbs long and unnaturally bent. The creature's skin was a patchwork of smooth obsidian and jagged, volcanic rock, reflecting the infernal glow around us. But what truly caught my attention were its eyes, or where its eyes should have been. Instead of pupils, there were only pits, black and endless, as if looking into them would pull you into the very heart of the void. And in those voids I could feel it, the hunger, the longing, the intelligence. It was more than a predator, it was a force of nature, something ancient, something that existed long before the eruption had ripped this land apart. I knew that in this place, I was nothing but prey. The thought was so overwhelming that I almost stopped moving. Almost. I forced myself to keep going, stumbling away from the fissure that had nearly consumed me. The ground quaked beneath my feet, and the wind howled louder, as if the land itself were laughing at my desperation. The creature behind me didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew that I would keep running, that I would keep making mistakes. It was patient, and that patience was what would kill me. But I wasn't ready to die, not yet. I wasn't ready to let this land swallow me whole. I reached a narrow ravine, the edges of which dropped sharply into a river of molten rock. I had no choice but to leap it, hoping my burning leg wouldn't give out beneath me. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward the edge, the sounds of the creature's footsteps drawing closer with every passing second. The gap between us was closing fast. I leapt. The air was thick with heat, my body soaring for what felt like an eternity before I hit the opposite ledge. My foot barely caught the jagged rock, and I tumbled forward, scraping my palms against the rough surface. But I didn't fall. I didn't let myself fall. My chest burned. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed myself upright. The air was thick with sulfur and smoke. I had made it, for now. But that shadow, that creature, it was still out there, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving. The fear gnawed at me, an ever-present gnawing that sunk deeper with each step. I was no longer sure if the true danger was the creatures I could see, or the ones I couldn't. The air itself felt alive, thick with something dark and ancient, something that could reach into my very soul. It wasn't just the predators that hunted me. It was the land, too. The wilds themselves seemed to hunger for my death. I couldn't hear anything over the deafening roar of the lava river. I needed to move away from it to get somewhere, anywhere that could give me cover. My hands, slick with sweat and grime, clawed at the ground, trying to find purchase on the jagged rocks. But even as I scrambled toward a small hillock that looked like it might provide some shelter, I knew, deep down, that this was a race I couldn't win. The wilds had a way of twisting everything. I wasn't just being hunted. I was being led. I stopped dead in my tracks. I hadn't heard the thing that had appeared until it was almost upon me. Its presence was like a shadow over my mind, creeping into the corners of my thoughts, wrapping its invisible fingers around my head. It moved like a whisper on the wind, silent, unseen, but suffocating. And now, in the darkened haze of the ash storm, I saw it. A figure. Not a creature. Not a beast. But something else, something human. It wasn't alive in the traditional sense. The thing that emerged from the mist didn't breathe, didn't bleed. Its skin was a patchwork of dead, burnt flesh and what looked like blackened bark. Its eyes hollow and sunken, like an ancient tree rotted to its core. Its shape flickered between forms, half human, half something else. Something monstrous. The creature, or whatever it was, glided toward me, its movements like the ripples of water on a still surface. Its mouth, if you could even call it that, opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. But what made my heart race wasn't its grotesque appearance. It was the scent, the sharp tang of burnt ozone and something older, something I couldn't name. It felt like the Ashfall Wilds itself had manifested, as if the land wanted me dead, and this thing was its agent. I backed away slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for my knife, but my fingers closed around nothing. I cursed, realizing I had dropped it earlier when I'd been running. The ground trembled again, and I looked up, realizing that I had backed myself into a corner. The hillock was just a small rise, surrounded by cracked rock and steaming vents. There was no way out. I turned back to face the creature, now only a few feet away. Its head tilted like it was considering me, measuring me, deciding. Its breathing was a low rasp, an almost gurgling noise that seemed to come from deep within its chest, or whatever was left of it. My heart beat louder in my ears. I could feel the air tightening, like the world itself was closing in. The heat from the vents surrounding me was unbearable, and the creature was close enough now that I could almost smell its decaying flesh. And then, with a sudden motion that was too quick to follow, it lunged. But just as it reached me, the ground shook once more, a violent tremor that knocked me to the ground. I had no time to register the explosion of dust and ash that followed. A new sound, a deep rumbling roar, echoed through the wilds, a noise like the eruption of a volcano. The air was filled with a scream, the kind of scream that rattled bones and stole breath. The creature hesitated. I didn't. I scrambled up, my legs screaming in agony, and I bolted again, the wild roar still echoing behind me, pushing me forward into the unknown. I didn't dare slow down. The roar still echoed in my mind, a cacophony of agony and rage that rattled my bones. Something bigger, something much more terrifying than the shadowed thing I'd seen, was out there in the wilds. But the thing that chased me, the grotesque, flickering creature, had paused, and that gave me the precious seconds I needed to escape. I ran, fueled by fear and desperation, my injured leg dragging, every breath like fire in my lungs. The land beneath me was a maze of broken rock, shifting ground, and streams of molten lava, each more dangerous than the last. The wild winds whipped at my face, but I hardly noticed anymore. The constant storm of ash and smoke had become part of the landscape, like a blanket of oblivion. But this time, the land seemed to push back. I had to dodge another fissure in the ground, a crack that opened without warning, the molten insides of the earth spilling into the air like liquid fire. I leapt over it, my leg giving out on the landing, and I tumbled, crashing hard into the ash. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, panic bubbling in my chest. I had to move, couldn't stop. I looked around, trying to find something, anything, that could help me navigate this hellscape, but the environment was alien, almost alive. The earth itself seemed to be shifting with every passing second, and what had once seemed like a mere wasteland now felt like an active predator. A massive, sentient entity that could sense my every movement, my every hesitation. The tremors were growing more frequent, as if the land itself were preparing for something terrible. The winds howled louder, carrying with them the unmistakable scent of sulfur and blood. And then I heard it, the sound of feet dragging against the ash. Not the thing that had almost caught me earlier. No, this was different. The sound was guttural, rhythmic, as though whatever was making it had no need for speed. No, this thing moved with a confidence, with a certainty that made my stomach turn. I turned. I had no choice but to face it. It emerged from the smoke, and my heart froze in my chest. It was huge, towering over me. Its limbs were long and twisted, covered in scales that shimmered with a sickly, iridescent glow. Its body was a mess of jagged, volcanic spikes and lumps of hardened lava rock. The creature's face, or what I assumed was its face, was a contorted mass of bone, its mouth too wide to be anything but a curse, rows of needle-sharp teeth dripping with venomous saliva. But what truly set it apart, what made my blood run cold, were its eyes. They were black pits, yes, but inside them, I saw the unmistakable flicker of something alive, something aware, something intelligent. It was a creature born of this land, a true monster of the Ashfall Wilds, a thing that had crawled up from the deepest cracks of the earth itself. It didn't just hunt. It stalked, it studied, it learned. And now it was learning me. My heart thumped in my chest, but I forced my legs to move, my instincts kicking in. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The creature advanced slowly, its claws dragging against the ground with a terrible scraping sound. It was savoring the moment. I could see it in the way it moved, in the tilt of its head, as if it was wondering whether it should end my life now or savor the chase a little longer. I didn't have time to question how I had come to this point, how a simple eruption had turned into this nightmare. All that mattered was surviving. I had to survive. I had to keep moving. I grabbed a loose rock from the ground, my fingers trembling as I hurled it toward the creature. It hit its massive body with a dull thud. The beast paused for a second, its head twitching slightly, as if considering the meaning of the attack. Then, without warning, it charged. I didn't wait to see if I could outrun it. I ran straight for the nearest outcrop of rock, a jagged peak that jutted out from the ground like a twisted finger pointing into the sky. My legs burned, my foot dragging as I pushed myself harder, faster, knowing that if I didn't reach cover, I wouldn't have a chance. I reached the outcrop just as the creature's claws scraped the ground behind me. I dove, slipping into the shadows of the rock just as the beast slammed into the stone wall, its claws gouging deep into the surface. The ground beneath me cracked, dust falling like snow, but I didn't stop. I crawled into a small alcove, the narrow gap between the rocks just wide enough for me to squeeze through. It was tight, too tight. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and ash, and I could feel my heart racing in my throat. I pressed my back to the stone, barely daring to breathe. The creature sniffed the air, its heavy breathing vibrating through the earth. I could hear its claws scraping against the stone as it prowled, moving slowly, deliberately. It knew I was here, could feel me. It was waiting, listening for any sound, any movement that might give me away. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant rumble of the volcano and the constant hiss of steam from the vents around me. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the creature's movements. I was pressed so close to the stone that I could feel it tremble with each of its steps. The minutes felt like hours. Every breath I took was heavy, labored, the air thick with ash. I tried to still my racing mind, forcing myself to think, to stay calm. I had to wait it out. I had to survive. But then, through the thick haze of smoke and heat, I heard something else, a faint rhythmic thud, like footsteps, but not from the creature that was hunting me. No, these were different. These were more deliberate. I peered around the edge of the alcove, my breath catching in my throat. Another figure emerged from the smoke. This one was smaller, but its movements were no less terrifying. It was humanoid in shape, but its skin was like molten rock, flowing and shifting in ways that defied nature. Its eyes were not eyes, but glowing cracks, glowing with an unnatural orange light that seemed to pulse with life. And as it moved, the ground seemed to respond to it. The earth cracked open, the air thickening as if the very land was bending to the will of this creature. I realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't just one predator. This was a hunting party. The second figure, no creature, advanced slowly, its body shifting and changing like liquid stone, its movements fluid and unsettling. As it drew closer, I realized with a sickening clarity that its glowing cracks weren't just light. They were alive. The fissures on its body pulsed like a beating heart, and every step it took seemed to tear open the very fabric of the earth beneath it. The ground groaned as if it were in pain. This was no mere hunter. This was something far worse. I pressed my back harder into the jagged stone behind me, my breath ragged in my chest. My eyes darted between the two creatures, the one hunting me and the one that had just appeared. The first, the monstrous behemoth with claws like daggers, seemed to be waiting, listening. But the second one, the one that moved like molten rock, it knew exactly where I was. The air around me grew heavier, the heat intensifying. It wasn't just the lava rivers or the molten vents anymore. No, this heat had a malevolent quality to it, as though the land itself was beginning to smother me, to force the very life from my body. The creature's glowing cracks burned brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the oppressive heat, like it was feeding off the land's fury. I couldn't move, not a muscle. I dared not make a sound. The second creature paused, its head turning slightly, as though it were sniffing the air, tasting the essence of my fear. Its glowing cracks flickered, casting a strange, sickly light on the rocks around us. It was watching me, no, feeling me. It wasn't the heat or the scent that gave me away. It was something deeper, something primal. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. I had no weapons, no real plan. My leg was on fire from the burn. Every step I'd taken felt like it had cost me an eternity of strength. And now, surrounded by creatures that hunted not just flesh but life itself, I was more than a mere prey. I was a victim. But then, something happened. A scream, loud, deep, unearthly, shattered the oppressive silence. It came from deep within the wilds, beyond where I could see, echoing through the dust-choked air. It was the kind of scream that made your blood run cold, that made every nerve in your body.
Scream danger.
The creature closest to me froze for just a second, its molten body jerking, twitching, like it was reacting to the sound. Its glowing cracks dimmed briefly, before they flared back to life. I took my chance. I darted from my hiding place, my body aching with every movement, my heart pounding like a drum. The pain in my leg was almost unbearable, but there was no choice. If I stayed hidden, I would die. If I moved, I might die, but I had a chance. I ran. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I only focused on putting one foot in front of the other, the jagged terrain beneath me offering no mercy. My mind screamed at me to find cover, but the wilds were an endless sea of danger. I had no destination, only escape. But the creatures were faster. They knew the land. They were the land. I could hear the first one, the hulking nightmare with its claws scraping across the ground, the sound getting louder with every passing second. And the second one, the molten one, wasn't far behind. I didn't know if it was chasing me or just following, but I could feel its presence in the air, its very being radiating heat like a furnace. The earth beneath me trembled. A series of cracks opened up ahead, molten rock bubbling to the surface. I barely avoided falling into one of them, my foot catching the edge of the cliff just as the ground beneath it gave way. My body was pulled forward, the air sharp in my lungs, my hands scraping against the rock as I tried to keep myself upright. Keep moving. I forced myself up, pain racking my muscles. It wasn't just my foot or my leg anymore. It was my entire body, screaming at me to stop, to give in. But I couldn't. Not yet. The scream from before echoed again. But this time it was closer, closer, and more guttural, like the very core of the land was splitting apart. It wasn't just one scream. It was a chorus of voices, a shriek that rose from the very bowels of the earth. Something was coming. Something was bigger than the creatures that hunted me. Suddenly, the ground before me cracked open, a deep fissure running from one side to the other, spewing forth jets of molten magma that seemed to reach for me. I jumped back, my heart in my throat as the heat from the eruption hit me like a wall of fire. And then, out of the smoke, out of the chaos, came the true nightmare. It was massive, too large to be anything alive in the traditional sense. It moved like a mountain had come to life, its body made of molten rock and ash, burning black eyes peering from within the depths of its volcanic form. It was a creature of pure destruction, its body shifting with every step, the earth trembling in its wake. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me thickened, charged with something so unnatural that my entire body felt heavy, weighed down. The world was falling apart, and I was in the heart of it. The first creature, its molten body still glowing, darted to the side, its sharp claws scraping against the rocks as it backed away from the monstrosity now emerging from the fissure. The second creature, the one with the glowing cracks, recoiled as well, its molten form shifting, the cracks dimming for a moment. But it wasn't fear in their eyes. It was respect. The thing before me was their master, the true ruler of the wilds. I realized with horror that I wasn't just in the middle of a hunt. I had stumbled into a ritual. The creature that had emerged was not merely a predator. It was an elder, a being born of the earth itself, a living manifestation of the volcanoes, the lava, the ash storms. It was a god of the Ashfall Wilds, a creature of such primal power that everything else in this hellscape was but an extension of its will. And now it was staring at me. I turned to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were too weak, my mind too dazed. And the thing, it was so close now. I was its prey. I froze. My blood turned to ice. My heart a stone lodged in my chest. The creature before me, it was not just some mindless beast. No, it was older than the wilds themselves. It was the volcano, the eruption, the burning fury of the earth given form. It was a god, a being so ancient, so powerful, that the very air seemed to warp around it. The air thickened as the thing loomed over me, its molten body glowing with a fiery light, as though it had been forged in the very heart of the earth. Its eyes, black as midnight, swirling with an unnatural heat, burned into mine, and for a moment, I thought I could feel its thoughts. Its hunger. It wasn't just looking at me. It was feeling me. I was no longer a mere creature caught in its path. No, I was something far worse. I was a sacrifice. The ground beneath my feet trembled as the creature's massive form shifted, cracking the earth like brittle stone. I staggered back, my body moving on instinct, but it was futile. There was nowhere to run. The wilds themselves were a cage. The creature opened its mouth, if you could even call it that, a gaping abyss of heat and flame, a maelstrom of fire. The very air around me seemed to bend toward its maw, drawn in by some unseen force. The heat became unbearable, and I stumbled backward, desperate for air, my throat searing as though I were breathing fire. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the way we understand voices. It was a rumble, deep and primal, the very sound of the earth's core groaning beneath me. You are not meant to be here. The words hit me like a physical blow, rattling through my bones. I couldn't understand them at first, but they seeped into my mind, curling around my thoughts like smoke, choking me with their weight. The thing's words weren't just a statement. They were a command, an edict from some ancient law of the world. The earth knew I didn't belong here. It was telling me that this place wasn't meant for humans, that the eruption, the ash, the lava, they were a natural order, a cleansing, a way of returning the world to something pure, something older. I wasn't just an intruder. I was an aberration. The ground beneath my feet began to shake violently, as though it too was trying to cast me out, to tear me apart. The creature lifted a massive, clawed limb, each talon as long as my arm, and brought it down toward me. The earth screamed, the sound deafening, and I knew, instinctively, that if that claw touched me, I would be nothing more than ash, dissolved into the very land that had borne this creature. I had no time to think, no time to plan. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The lava around me surged, molten rocks spilling from cracks in the earth, sending jets of fire into the sky. I ducked and dove, narrowly avoiding the molten rivers that snaked through the ground, feeling the heat searing my skin as I pushed forward, my legs threatening to collapse beneath me. Behind me, the earth groaned in agony, the roar of the creature shaking the very sky. It was coming. It was coming for me, the earth itself reaching for my life, pulling me back into its inferno. My foot caught on a jagged rock, and I went down, my hands scraping against the burning ground. The pain was blinding, But I didn't stop. Couldn't. I pushed myself up, forcing my body to move even as every nerve screamed for me to give up. But I had no choice. There was no future for me in this place. No escape, no hope. The Ashfall Wilds didn't want me to live, and it would make sure of that. The ground cracked open before me, and a surge of molten lava erupted from the fissure, spraying across the terrain like an explosion of fire. I leaped back, my body screaming, my vision blurring as I narrowly avoided the eruption. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. I kept running, the world around me warping in the heat, the ash swirling in my eyes. Suddenly, there was another scream. The same chilling sound from before, the one that had set the creatures into motion. But now it was louder, closer. The air vibrated with it, the sound reverberating in my skull like a storm of rage. And then, out of the smoke, I saw it. A new figure, a new creature, one far more terrifying than anything I had encountered before. It was like a shadow made flesh, tall, impossibly tall, its body stretching into the sky like a twisted pillar of bone and rock. Its limbs were long and gangly, each finger tipped with claws that dripped with molten liquid. Its skin was made of ash, so fine it looked like dust. But there was something moving beneath it, something alive, something dark and hungry. The creature's head was a twisted mass of stone, with no face, only cracks, deep, jagged fissures running through its skull, revealing the fiery glow of its insides. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze on me, cold and malevolent, as though it could see me better than any living creature ever could. I didn't stop to wonder what it was. Couldn't. I just ran. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't dare look back. Not now. The world around me seemed to collapse in on itself. I could hear the creatures, both the molten one and the godlike monster, moving behind me, the ground trembling beneath their steps, the very air crackling with their power. And then, as I stumbled into a crevasse, the world shook once more. The earth split open beneath me. I fell. The world disappeared beneath me. One moment, I was running, my legs fueled by sheer panic, and the next, the ground cracked open, sending me plummeting into the abyss. The air was sucked from my lungs as I fell, the wind whipping past me like a storm, and the ground beneath me fractured with every passing second. My body slammed against jagged rocks, my bones rattling in my frame, but I didn't stop falling. It felt like I was falling into the very heart of the earth itself. A scream caught in my throat, but it was swallowed by the roar of the world collapsing around me. And then, suddenly, nothing. I hit something hard. Stone, rock, or perhaps something worse, and everything went black. I woke to the sound of distant rumbling, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The earth beneath me was warm, unnaturally so, as though I had been swallowed by the heart of the volcano itself. My body ached. Every inch of me screamed in pain. My legs, my arms, my chest. All of it felt like it was on fire. But I couldn't stay still. Not here. Not in this place. I pushed myself up, using the jagged walls of the crevasse to steady myself. The air was thick with the acrid scent of sulfur and decay. Above me, the fissure I had fallen through was a distant, unreachable memory. The world above swallowed by the madness of the wilds. The darkness here was different. It wasn't the storm of ash and smoke that I had known. It was deeper, denser. The shadows pressed in on me, suffocating me with their weight. It felt like the very walls of the earth were closing in, like the land itself was a beast, a predator, waiting for me to make a single mistake. I staggered forward, my feet finding purchase on the uneven rock beneath me. The ground seemed to pulse, a steady, rhythmic vibration that seeped through the soles of my boots, rattling my teeth. The hum grew louder with each step I took. And then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible in the flickering, dim light of the cavern, there was a shape, a massive, looming figure, a twisted silhouette that seemed to stretch from floor to ceiling. It was like a monument, a gargantuan structure of stone and molten rock. But it wasn't a natural formation. It was alive. I stumbled back, my eyes widening as I realized what I was looking at. The creature that had risen from the earth. the one I had thought of as the god of the wilds, was not alone. It was not just a mindless destroyer. It was part of something far more horrifying. This was its source. The massive structure before me was a living thing, a being of pure destruction. Its body was made of molten rock and ash, and it stretched so high that I couldn't even make out its true shape. But I could see the cracks running through it, the glowing fissures that burned like eyes. The walls around it were scarred, scorched by its very presence. The air shimmered with the heat emanating from it, and I could feel the power radiating from it, raw, untamed, and ancient. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature that had stalked me through the wilds had come from here. This was where it and everything else had been born. A low, hissing sound filled the air, and the earth around me trembled. The ground began to crack beneath my feet, and I looked down to see fissures opening, dark veins of molten rock running through the stone. It was alive, and it was waking. My breath caught in my throat. The creature, the god of the wilds, was not just a predator. It was a part of something far greater. The wilds themselves were not a land of random destruction. No, they were a living entity, and the things that inhabited it were its children. The creatures I had seen, the monstrous, twisted forms of molten rock and ash, were all born from this place. They were its agents, its hunters. They existed to protect it, to feed it, to keep the cycle going. The wilds were not a place of chaos, as I had believed. They were a system, an ecosystem, a perfect balance of predator and prey, of death and rebirth. And I was intruder. I turned, my pulse racing, my instincts screaming at me to escape, to run, but the earth was alive around me. The walls shook, the ground cracked open again, and from the crevices poured more of the creatures. These were smaller, quicker, their eyes glowing with that same ancient fire. They moved like liquid, their forms shifting with every step. And they were closing in. I had no choice. I ran. The cavern stretched on forever, twisting in impossible ways. The walls around me pressed in, narrowing the space until I was racing through a claustrophobic tunnel of jagged rock. The creatures followed, their movements faster, more fluid than I could have imagined. I could hear their shrieks, their hissing, as they chased me through the winding labyrinth. I had to keep moving. The hum from the creature's heart, its source, grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath me. The walls were collapsing, cracks running through the stone, molten rock spilling out from the seams. The air was thick with ash, the heat unbearable. I was suffocating, my lungs searing with every breath I took. Then I saw it, a narrow path, a crack in the earth that seemed to lead up toward the surface. It was my only chance. I dove for it, slipping through the gap just as the creatures lunged forward, their claws scraping against the rock. The molten ones were close now, too close. I could hear their breathing, feel the heat from their bodies. I pushed myself up, climbing with everything I had left. My fingers scraped against the stone, the heat scorching my skin, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The crack was narrow, but I forced my way through it, my body half buried in rock, gasping for air. The creatures were still behind me, their claws snapping against the stone, their shrieks growing louder. And then, as I reached the top of the crack, I saw the sky, dark, churning with smoke and ash, the volcano looming above me like a dark god. The ground trembled beneath me as I pulled myself up, just as a massive, flaming claw reached toward me from the darkness below. I was out, but the Ashfall Wilds were still alive. I stumbled out of the crack in the earth, gasping for breath as I collapsed onto the rocky surface. The sky above me was a maelstrom of ash, the sun hidden behind an ever-growing storm of volcanic smoke. The heat pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and burned flesh. The wilds had claimed me, body and soul, but now I was free, or so I thought. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body was battered, bruised, and weak. The burn on my leg throbbed, my skin raw from the constant exposure to the searing heat. But worse than the physical pain was the fear, the gnawing, relentless fear that something was still out there, watching, The ground beneath me trembled again, a low rumble, like the earth was waking up. I looked back, my eyes searching the horizon, hoping, praying, that I had escaped whatever nightmare I had been thrown into. But what I saw only deepened the pit in my stomach. The volcano, the source, loomed before me, its molten rivers flowing like veins, burning with the same fire that had consumed everything else. From its core, a great, terrible roar echoed through the air, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. And then, rising from the depths of the ash and smoke, I saw it. The creature, the god of the wilds, now fully awake. Its massive, molten form towered over me, a shadow of darkness and fire. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was the very essence of the wilds themselves. The earth had birthed it, and it had shaped the world into its own image. Every creature that had stalked me, every creature that had hunted me, had been its child. It was not just a god. It was the earth, the volcano, the wild chaos of nature, alive and breathing. The wilds were not a place. They were a force of destruction, of rebirth, and of endless hunger. I had been wrong. I hadn't escaped. Not really. I had run from the predators, the horrors, but in the end, there was no escape from the Ashfall Wilds. The wilds were not just a land to be survived. They were alive, and I was just another part of its cycle, another soul to be consumed. And now the creature was coming for me. I turned and ran, not looking back. The roar of the creature echoed in my ears, the sound of a living mountain, a god, chasing me through the wilds. But even as I ran, I knew something. I knew the wilds would not let me go. The land had claimed me, and it would not release me. The creature, the god of the wilds, would never let me leave. It was too late. I could hear the rumble of its footsteps behind me, feel the heat intensifying with each second. The lava rivers that once seemed distant were now closing in, creeping like fiery veins toward my path. The air shimmered with the heat of its fury. It was not just chasing me. It was making its way to me, slow but inevitable, like the rising tide of a storm. I looked ahead, but the land was just as dangerous. The same jagged cliffs, the same shifting earth, the same molten rivers. There was nowhere to run. The Ashfall Wilds had no mercy. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled violently, more than ever before. I lost my footing and fell, my hands scraping against the burning rock, the heat searing my flesh. I tried to scramble to my feet, but the tremor was so strong now that the very earth itself seemed to be shifting beneath me. The surface cracked open, revealing a chasm that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I could hear the creature behind me, its roar growing louder. It was almost here, but so was the chasm. The ground split open, a vast, black void opening beneath me. It was the end. There was no escape. And then I made my decision. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't hide. I had to face it. I stood there, the heat pressing down on me, the ashes swirling around me like a storm. I closed my eyes, knowing that death was inevitable. But I had no choice but to face it head-on. The god of the wilds was upon me now, towering over me like a living mountain. The very air around me was thick with its heat, the ground cracking under its immense weight. I could feel its presence in my bones, in my chest, like an earthquake of pure rage and hunger. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, burned through me. Its molten body flickered, shifting with the power of the volcano itself. And then it spoke. You were never meant to survive. The voice was not a sound. It was a feeling, a command like the earth itself was speaking. It was as if the wilds were reminding me that I was just a fleeting thing, a human weakness in the face of the endless cycle of destruction. But there was something else, too. Something deeper. A choice. The creature raised its clawed hand, ready to crush me, to obliterate me into the very dust of the earth. But in that moment I understood. I was not just an intruder. I was part of the wilds, whether I wanted to be or not. The wilds had claimed me. The creature had risen because of me, because of all of us. Humans, the invaders, the weak. We were the reason the wilds had come to life. We had disturbed the earth, and it had answered. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing to face it. I was choosing to embrace the wilds. The god of the wilds seemed to hesitate for a moment, its molten form flickering as if sensing something deep inside me. It was the power of the earth, of the fire and the ash, of everything that had shaped this world. And now, in my acceptance, I felt it too. I was part of the cycle. And as the earth cracked open beneath me, as the god raised its hand to end me, I did not fight. I did not scream. I let it consume me. Long before the Ashfall Wilds became the suffocating, volcanic nightmare that consumed anyone foolish enough to enter, the land was once lush and vibrant, untouched by the catastrophic forces that would soon reshape it. The Ashfall Wilds were born of an ancient cataclysm, a series of eruptions so fierce that they fractured the very core of the earth, creating a new ecosystem, a realm of fire, ash, and molten rock. This new world was not simply born of destruction, but of creation. The volcanoes, the rivers of lava, the creatures that crawled, slithered, and flew. These were the Earth's attempt to rebuild itself after humanity had pushed the land to its breaking point. The ancient world had been one of human ambition. Centuries before the eruption, humanity had discovered a way to harness the Earth's energy, mining deep into the crust, drawing power from the molten rivers beneath. What they didn't know was that their greed had awoken something ancient, something far older than their civilizations. The land they had exploited began to stir. It was no longer a land of resources. It was a land of power, a sentient force that had waited eons for its time to rise again. The first eruption was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was not just a burst of fire and ash. It was a declaration. The earth had taken back what was hers, and the people were scattered in the winds of her wrath. Entire cities were swallowed whole, their remains consumed by the molten rivers. The earth itself shifted, reshaping the geography into a nightmarish labyrinth of jagged rocks, rivers of lava, and shifting walls of ash. What was left were those few who survived, the ones who had not been within the blast radius. They wandered, unaware of what had truly happened, not understanding that the land was now something else entirely. Centuries passed, and the Ashfall Wilds became a myth. Most people stayed far away from the land of fire, considering it cursed or haunted by monsters. But there were always those who were drawn to the wilds, those seeking to understand, to conquer, or to extract what little was left. A group of explorers, far from the boundaries of civilization, heard the stories of the wilds. They were drawn not by treasure, but by the whispers of something greater, something powerful, something alive, a land of creation, where life could be molded from fire and rock. Among them was Elara, a scientist with a fascination for the Earth's geothermal energy, and Corwin, a former soldier turned mercenary. They were joined by a diverse group, engineers, historians, and adventurers, each with their own reasons for entering the wilds. Some wanted to discover the secrets of the land, others were simply searching for fame or fortune, but none of them understood what they were truly walking into. As they crossed the borders of the wilds, the ground beneath them trembled. The air grew thick with sulfur, and the sky darkened with ash. Elara felt it first, the strange hum in the earth, a low vibration that seemed to speak directly to her bones. The others were hesitant, but they pressed on, their curiosity and ambition outweighing the fear. "It's just geothermal activity," Elara reassured them, though even she wasn't convinced. The closer they came to the heart of the wilds, the more she felt an unsettling presence, as though the land itself was aware of them. It wasn't long before the first signs of life appeared. The creatures of the wilds were not like anything the explorers had encountered before. They were not beasts in the traditional sense. They were born of fire, ash, and molten rock. Their forms shifted, twisted, and flickered with the heat of the earth's core. Some were large, with limbs of stone and eyes like burning coals. Others were smaller, fast-moving, and insidious, stalking through the smoke-filled skies like living shadows. At first, the explorers thought they were simply witnessing the fallout of the eruptions, creatures born from the volcanoes, mutated by the constant flow of lava and heat. But soon they realized they were wrong. These creatures were not born of random chance. They were a part of the system. They had evolved to survive in the wild's brutal environment. Some of them hunted in packs, while others were solitary, moving with terrifying precision. They didn't just hunt for food. They hunted to maintain the balance of the wilds. They were the keepers of the land, ensuring that the cycle of destruction and rebirth continued. Corwin, ever the pragmatic soldier, was the first to realize that the creatures weren't just animals. They were guardians, sentinels, and they weren't about to let anyone disrupt the land they had sworn to protect. The explorers' journey quickly turned from discovery to survival. They could no longer trust the ground beneath their feet, for it seemed to shift and tremble at the will of the wilds. The lava rivers, once distant, now seemed to surge with life, moving like living veins, cutting through the landscape with unstoppable force. The air grew thicker with each passing day, and the ash storms became more frequent and violent. One night, as they set up camp near a still, glowing river of lava, they were attacked. The creatures struck in the dark, moving with such speed and precision that they were almost impossible to see until it was too late. Elara was the first to hear the sound, a low, deep hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then came the crackle of movement, the faint shifting of air, and the sound of something heavy stalking them. It was Corwin who first saw it. A massive, stone-like creature, its body shifting in and out of the molten rock. It was covered in jagged spikes, and its eyes burned like twin embers. It didn't move like a predator. It moved like a judge, determined to pass its sentence. The creature lunged, faster than they could react, and Corwin was the first to fall. The others scattered, desperate to escape, but the wilds were closing in on them, the creatures relentless in their pursuit. The explorers learned the hard way that the wilds were not a place to be conquered. They were a force to be understood, and to understand them was to become part of the cycle itself. It was Elara who eventually pieced together the truth, that the wilds were not just a random disaster, but a living, breathing ecosystem that had evolved to maintain balance. Life and death, creation and destruction were intertwined. The creatures were part of the land's intricate system, each playing a role in the cycle of the earth. Elara knew they couldn't escape. They could only try to survive long enough to understand the wild's true purpose. But what they didn't realize was that, by entering the wilds, they had already become a part of it. The land had already begun to change them. In the end, only Elara and a few others managed to escape the wilds. But they were not the same. The experience had transformed them, and they brought the wilds back with them. It wasn't just the physical changes. Their skin seemed darker. Their eyes burned with the intensity of the volcano, but something deeper had shifted. Elara could hear the hum of the earth now. She could feel it calling her, and she knew she would return. There was no choice. The wilds had claimed her, and when the next eruption came, she would be there. Humanity would continue to encroach upon the wilds, never understanding that the land was not something to be tamed. It was something to be feared, and one day the wilds would rise again, stronger, more powerful than ever before. And this time there would be no escaping it. Elara's escape from the wilds had been harrowing. She had lost everything: friends, comrades, and a part of herself. When she returned to civilization, the world felt wrong. The air was too clean, the ground too still. She had seen the fires of the earth and the creatures born of them. She had felt the pulse of the wilds, the unrelenting beat of nature's cycle. But she couldn't forget the hum. It was there, always, just beneath her skin, a vibration that no one else could hear. It was like the earth itself was calling her back. In the silence of her quiet apartment, surrounded by books and the cold sterility of human invention, Elara felt small. The hum was a reminder of the wild's vastness. She wasn't part of this world anymore. She had touched something primal, something that had existed long before humanity's fleeting grasp on civilization. At first, she thought it was a memory, a trauma-induced sensation. But then the dreams started. Every night, Elara was swept into the same vision. She stood at the edge of a vast chasm, the volcano's fiery breath rising from the depths below. The creatures, large and small, swarmed around her, their molten eyes burning with recognition. She tried to move, but the ground trembled beneath her feet, and the chasm threatened to swallow her whole. Then, the hum would return, louder, more insistent. She realized that the wilds weren't just a place. They were a calling, a force that demanded attention, that refused to be ignored. In these dreams, she felt an ancient, unknowable power, the pulse of the earth itself, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. When she woke, the sensation lingered. Her skin felt like it was burning, and her eyes would water from the heat. It was as if the ash and smoke had embedded themselves in her lungs, in her veins, and the transformation had begun. Weeks passed. Elara couldn't shake the sense that something inside her was shifting. It started slowly, small things at first. Her skin began to darken, as if kissed by the ash itself. Her hair seemed to glow faintly, reflecting the fiery light of the wilds she had left behind. And then there were the eyes. They had always been brown, dull in comparison to the molten reds and oranges of the wilds. But now, they burned with an inner light, flickering like embers beneath the surface. She could see heat signatures, shadows in the dark, the warmth of living things hidden beneath layers of stone and metal. But the most unsettling part was the hum, the feeling that the earth was never truly silent. She could hear it beneath her feet, like a drumbeat, the deep pulse of the earth's molten heart. It was inevitable. Elara couldn't stay away any longer. The wilds were pulling her back, calling her to the place where she had encountered the unknown. But she was no longer the same person who had left. Her transformation had started, and the pull of the land had only grown stronger. She packed a small bag, her maps, a few tools, and a journal, and boarded a plane back to the outskirts of the wilds. She had no intention of returning to the heart of the volcanic chaos. Not yet, but she had to understand. She had to know what the earth wanted from her, why it had chosen her. Her arrival at the edge of the wilds felt almost ceremonial. The landscape was the same, bleak, fiery, and oppressive, but now it felt different, more alive. Elara felt the pulse in her chest, in her veins, as though she were in sync with the land itself. She stepped forward, her heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. As Elara moved deeper into the wilds, she began to see them, the creatures. They didn't attack immediately, though she knew they were watching. She could feel their eyes on her, their presence like a weight on her shoulders. The creatures had once seemed terrifying, monstrous, but now, in the shadow of the volcano, they seemed familiar. And then she saw it, a figure, half human, half creature, standing in the distance. Its body was made of stone, but its eyes glowed like molten lava. It was a guardian, one of the beings that had stalked the explorers, but this one didn't seem to want to attack. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying her. She was not an intruder, but a part of the cycle. Elara stepped closer, heart racing, as the figure's form shifted, revealing more details of its molten body. Its limbs were jagged, covered in sharp, rock-like protrusions. But the closer she got, the clearer it became that this creature was waiting for something. The creature stepped forward, its massive form shifting with each step. Its molten eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, Elara felt the earth speak to her. Not in words, but in sensations. The pulse of the volcano, the crack of the shifting earth, the rise and fall of the creatures. It was all part of the same system. She was part of it. The realization hit her like a wave. The wilds had chosen her because she had understood it. She had come here not to conquer, but to be a part of it, to become part of the earth's natural cycle. And now, as her transformation completed, she could feel it. She could feel the power of the volcano coursing through her, igniting her from within. Her transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual. The wilds had marked her, and she could feel the pulse of the earth in her bones. She had become one with the fire, one with the ash. She could hear the hum of the volcano's heart, and it beat in rhythm with her own. The creature stepped aside, allowing her to pass. It wasn't leading her anywhere. It was simply showing her that she had been accepted. The wilds no longer saw her as an outsider, but as a part of its ever-turning cycle. She had been chosen to carry on the work of the earth. In the days that followed, Elara stayed in the wilds, learning the ways of the creatures and the land. The volcano was no longer just a place of destruction, it was a place of creation. And Elara had become one of its keepers, watching over the land and ensuring that the balance was maintained. The humans who had once sought to conquer the wilds were no longer a concern. They would return, of course, they always did, but Elara knew that the wilds would never be tamed. They would never be conquered. And those who sought to take from the earth without understanding would always be consumed by it. Her body was no longer entirely human. The transformation was complete. She had become something new, part woman, part earth. Her skin shimmered with the glow of molten rock. Her eyes burned with the light of the volcano's fire, and her heart beat in time with the earth's eternal hum. The cycle would continue. The wilds would rise and fall, and Elara would be there to guide the way. The last days in the wilds had been a blur of blood, terror, and desperate flight. After Corwin fell, and the others were either devoured or left behind, only 3 of the original expedition members managed to escape: Elara, Jax, and Mira. The others were lost to the wilds, swallowed by the fire and stone, becoming part of the land itself. But the horrors they had witnessed never left them. When they stumbled back into civilization, they were greeted with disbelief. No one truly understood what had happened. The government-funded mission had been deemed a failure, a tragic accident. Elara tried to explain the truth, to describe the creatures, the hum of the earth, the pull of the land, but she was dismissed. Jax, once a hardened soldier, had tried to keep his composure, but even he could not hide the change in him. He was quieter now, as if some part of him had broken in the wilds and could never be fixed. Mira, on the other hand, tried to move on, but the trauma of losing so many people weighed heavily on her. She could not reconcile the peaceful life she had left behind with the madness she had witnessed. Jax had been the least affected at first. He had always prided himself on being a realist, a soldier who could face danger head-on. The wilds had been a challenge, yes, but Jax was a man of action, someone who adapted quickly. But after the mission, things began to slip. At first, he had nightmares, then hallucinations. He would wake in a cold sweat, hearing the hum, the same hum that Elara had heard in the wilds. He could feel the heat, the tremors beneath his feet. The earth itself seemed to call to him. He stopped sleeping, growing thinner and more gaunt with each passing day. It was on a routine mission, months after their return, when he heard it for the first time outside the wilds, the hum, clearer now, resonating deep within his chest. His body reacted without his control. His skin burned with heat, and his heartbeat quickened. It was as if the wilds had never truly let him go. He tried to fight it, to ignore the call, but the earth was no longer something he could escape. One night, when the hum was unbearable, Jax found himself standing in the middle of a clearing, staring at the horizon. The volcanoes in the distance glowed faintly, a fiery reminder of the land he had left behind. And in that moment, he knew. The wilds were pulling him back. He was already changing. His skin was darkening, his veins tracing the patterns of molten rock. The soldier he had been, the man who fought for his country, was slipping away. He was becoming something else. Mira was a historian, a scholar who had always believed in facts and rationality. The wilds had been a scientific venture for her, an opportunity to learn about an unknown ecosystem. She hadn't expected to come back broken, haunted by what she had witnessed. In the days after their return, Mira buried herself in research. She tried to make sense of what they had seen, trying to find patterns in the chaos. But every time she opened the files, the images of the creatures would surface. Those molten eyes, the way the ground had shifted beneath them, the sound of the earth's violent tremors. Mira couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She started to see things. Shadows at the corners of her vision. Strange markings that looked like the tracks of creatures she could never forget. The wilds had invaded her thoughts, consumed her mind. And the hum. It was always there, like a ringing in her ears, constant and deafening. She began to hear voices, whispers in the night. They were calling her, beckoning her toward something. The volcanoes, the rivers of lava, they were in her dreams, a part of her now. And like Jax, she couldn't ignore the pull. But Mira didn't want to acknowledge it. She didn't want to return to the wilds. Instead, she fought it, convincing herself that if she could just bury the past, bury the memories of the creatures, of the ash that had choked her lungs, she could go back to her life. She could forget. But every time she tried, the hum grew louder. Days turned into weeks, and the trio of survivors began to fall apart. They had been shattered by the wilds, each in their own way. Elara, though transformed, had found some peace in the knowledge that she was a part of something greater. But Jax and Mira were still fighting it. It wasn't long before Jax disappeared. No one knew where he had gone. He simply vanished into the night, his absence, marked by a single word scrawled on a piece of paper: return. Mira's search for him led her to the borders of the wilds, where she found traces of his presence. Footprints burned into the ground, the remnants of fire. The wilds had claimed him just as they had claimed Elara. She could feel it in the air, the pulse that had drawn him back, and she knew, deep in her heart, that Jax had become one with the land. But what about her? Mira didn't know if she could return to the wilds. She had already lost so much: her comrades, her mind, her sanity. But the pull was undeniable, stronger than anything she had ever felt. She stood at the edge, staring out at the ever-shifting land of fire and stone, the place where her friends had fallen. Elara had changed. Jax had changed. The wilds had taken them and molded them into something new. She felt the hum vibrating through her bones, and knew that she was not immune. She had no choice. The wilds were calling, and she would answer. As Mira stepped into the wilds, the air thick with ash and the earth rumbling beneath her feet, she realized that she had crossed the threshold into something far greater than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just a scholar, a historian, a mere observer of the world's secrets. She was now part of the wilds. She had always been part of it. The cycle of life and death, destruction and creation, it was all the same. She had thought she could resist, but the wilds had a way of drawing in those who had once tried to understand them. Elara had embraced it, Jax had been consumed by it, and now Mira would join them. She would become part of the land, part of the fire, part of the molten rock and ash. And the wilds would continue to rise, to destroy, and to create, as they always had. Each time it would claim new souls, transforming them into something greater than they had ever been. The cycle would never end. The Ashfall Wilds were no longer a mere myth. The government had suppressed the details of the disaster for years, but the survivors had returned with chilling accounts. They spoke of creatures born from fire and stone, of a land alive with an ancient, untamable energy. No one believed them at first, dismissing their stories as the ravings of traumatized survivors. But the whispers spread, and as Elara, Jax, and Mira's physical transformations became undeniable, so too did the realization that something greater was happening, something far beyond human comprehension. Media outlets were the first to report on the strange phenomenon. These survivors, once ordinary people, had become something other. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Their skin shifted in color like the earth beneath the volcanoes, and their abilities defied all logic. Their transformations weren't just physical. There was something primal about them now. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They had become creatures of the wilds, vessels of the earth's power. At first, the public was fascinated. Scientists especially were eager to study them. Elara, now a walking, breathing paradox of science and myth, became the focus of endless inquiries. The journalists followed her every step, desperate for an interview that might unlock the mysteries of the land. But as time passed, the fascination turned to fear. The transformations of the survivors were not just a mystery, they were a threat. Governments, fearful of the wild's influence spreading beyond the individuals, began to take action. They first tried to silence the survivors, restricting their movements, monitoring their every conversation. But the wilds had already claimed them, and the survivors were no longer compliant. They were changing on their own terms. The United Nations, caught in the crossfire, declared the Ashfall Wilds an uninhabitable zone off-limits to all but the most authorized expeditions. But the pressure from various factions was mounting. Corporations began offering large sums of money for any technology or biological samples that could be recovered from the wilds. Political power brokers, desperate for control over this new and mysterious force, demanded that Elara and the others be brought to them for study. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. Elara tried to explain, time and time again, that the wilds were not something to be controlled. They were an ancient force, alive and dangerous. But it was clear no one was listening. Mira, once a rational historian, was now a full participant in the game. Having gone into hiding, she was torn between the temptation to escape the attention of the world and the growing pull to return to the wilds, to understand them more fully. The land was a part of her now. It called to her in ways she could not ignore. And Jax had vanished completely. No one knew where he had gone. His disappearance sparked rumors that he had gone back to the wilds on his own, drawn by the same pull that had claimed the others. Some believed that he was dead, consumed by the land, but others whispered that he had become something far more powerful, something even more dangerous than the wilds themselves. As the survivors' transformations continued, new cases began to surface. More and more people who had ventured too close to the wilds began to show signs of change. Some reported hearing the hum, the low, vibrating pulse of the earth. Others felt their bodies burning with heat, their eyes shifting in color, their skin taking on the texture of volcanic stone. These afflicted individuals, as they were called, were quarantined by the government, kept in high-security facilities for study. But even in these sterile environments, they could not be contained. Their bodies, like Jack's, began to warp in ways that defied biology. Scientists struggled to explain it. Was it a virus? A biological mutation? Or was it something far more metaphysical, an infection of the soul, perhaps? As the numbers grew, it became clear that the wilds were not just changing the survivors, they were infecting them. The hum was spreading, and with it, the power of the wilds. Elara, unlike the others, had found a strange peace in her transformation. Her body was no longer purely human. Her skin was hard and volcanic, veins glowed like molten rock, and her eyes flickered with an inner fire. She could sense the land, feel its heartbeat deep within her bones. It wasn't just the earth. It was the wilds themselves, speaking to her, pulling her toward the core of their power. One night, she stood before a television camera, speaking directly to the public. It had been a year since the mission, and the world was watching closely. She had hoped to offer some understanding, to help people see the wilds for what they truly were. Not a curse, but a force of nature. "The wilds are alive," she said, her voice steady but imbued with the raw power of the earth. "They were born of the earth's core, and they will continue to evolve. We cannot control them. We cannot conquer them. But we must learn to live with them." The studio audience sat in stunned silence. The camera zoomed in on her face, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. "The earth is awakening," she continued, her voice reverberating like the tremor of an earthquake. "And it's calling to us. It will shape us, for better or worse. The question is, will we listen?" Meanwhile, Mira had begun to feel the final pull. It was subtle at first, just whispers in her ear, the faintest sensation of heat, the constant feeling that something was waiting for her. But the closer she got to the wilds, the clearer the call became. It was undeniable. She had tried to fight it for so long, but she was no longer the woman who had once lived for facts and reason. The wilds had reshaped her, and now she understood. She couldn't fight it anymore. Mira left her safe house, alone, and ventured back into the heart of the wilds. She knew the dangers. She knew that the wilds were a place where people didn't come back, but she had to go. There was a truth there, something that could only be understood within the wilds, something she had always been meant to find. Her journey was perilous. The land was alive, shifting around her, but Mira felt at home in the chaos. The creatures of the wilds, now familiar to her, watched her from the shadows. She knew they weren't out to kill her. They were guardians. They were protectors of the cycle. And then she saw it, the heart of the wilds. The volcanoes erupted in a fiery display, a breathtaking show of power, and at the center of it all, there was something else. Something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for her. It was there, amidst the shifting rock and ash, that Elara's words rang true. The wilds were more than a place. They were a being, a conscious force of nature that had lived, died, and been reborn countless times. The land was its vessel, the creatures its servants, and the humans who entered its domain. They were its chosen. Elara had felt it, Jax had felt it, and now Mira felt it. They were part of the wild's eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth. This was their fate. The world, outside the borders of the wilds, would never truly understand. They would never be able to control the land. And eventually, they would have to accept the reality. The wilds were coming for everyone. Whether humanity was ready or not, the earth would rise again, and it would take what was rightfully its own. As the Ashfall Wilds grew stronger, the world outside began to fracture. What had once been dismissed as a scientific curiosity or a tragedy was now something far more dangerous, a force of nature that no human could contain. It wasn't just the survivors who had changed. Across the globe, other areas began to show signs of the wild's influence. Small towns near volcanic regions reported strange occurrences. People suddenly hearing the hum, experiencing uncontrollable heat, and seeing flashes of molten light in the sky. Scientists were baffled. Geologists had long theorized that the Earth's core was a molten, restless place. But they had no idea that this primal energy could manifest itself in such a direct way. Theories of geothermal fluxes, tectonic instability, and electromagnetic fields were no longer enough to explain the rising phenomena. But the truth was even more terrifying. The wilds were not contained by borders or laws. The energy had begun to leak outward, infecting the very air, water, and soil. The land was awakening, and it was taking the people who dared to enter its proximity with it. Mass evacuations were ordered in many areas, but it was too late. The wilds didn't care about borders or the convenience of human cities. They were the Earth's heartbeat, and they were calling all to return. As Elara, Jax, and Mira grew ever more powerful, their bodies and minds were increasingly bound to the land. The changes in them were undeniable. They were no longer simply survivors, they were vessels, conduits for the wild's energy. Elara had embraced her transformation fully. The once gentle historian had become a force of nature. Her skin had turned black and craggy, like volcanic rock. Her hair, once blonde and delicate, was now long braided and laced with streaks of glowing magma. Her eyes shimmered with molten fire, and she had learned to tap into the heat, controlling it to manipulate her environment. She was no longer limited by human frailty. Her presence alone could raise the temperature around her, causing the air to crackle with energy. The wilds had awakened in her. She could feel the land's pulse beneath her skin, a deep, steady vibration that resonated within her very core. Elara's powers had grown beyond what even she could have imagined. But there was a price. The more she tapped into the wilds, the less human she became. Her thoughts, once full of the wonders of history and knowledge, had begun to fade, replaced by an overwhelming drive to return to the heart of the wilds, to merge fully with the land. Jax, on the other hand, had grown even more alien. His skin had begun to crack and harden like magma, veins of fiery red and orange tracing under his surface. He had once been a soldier, stoic and disciplined, but the wilds had stripped away his humanity. He had become something akin to a guardian of the land, a living extension of the volcanoes and rivers of lava that crisscrossed the wilds. Jax could sense the wilds in a way that no human could. The creatures, the shifting terrain, the pulses of energy that surged through the earth, it was all part of him now. His senses had become heightened beyond measure. He could hear the distant hum of the earth's heart from miles away. He could feel the smallest tremor in the ground, a sign of the wild's ever-growing hunger. The transformation was no longer just physical. Jax's mind was starting to merge with the wilds themselves. He had no fear of death, no desire for survival. He existed solely to preserve the cycle of destruction and rebirth that the wilds represented. He was becoming something other, a being of fire and stone. Mira's transformation had been slower, more insidious. At first, she had tried to resist the pull. But the land had infected her thoughts, her body, her very soul. The longer she stayed away from the wilds, the more the hum of the earth gnawed at her, until she could not ignore it any longer. Her skin had begun to darken, covered in faint patterns of volcanic stone. Her eyes were the color of molten rock, constantly shifting in hue as they reflected the fire and ash of the wilds. She had learned to control the flames that burned within her, her hands now capable of manipulating fire with a single thought. But unlike Jax and Elara, Mira was torn. She had always been a scholar, a seeker of knowledge. But now, as the wilds reshaped her, she began to question her identity. Was she still the person she had been before? Was she still human? Or had she crossed into something new, something not quite alive, not quite dead? While the survivors had embraced their transformations, the world was spiraling into chaos. News of the changes spread like wildfire. Political leaders, fearing the power of the wilds and the influence of the transformed survivors, moved to isolate them. Some proposed quarantining the survivors, seeing them as weapons, as living, breathing biohazards that could bring about the end of humanity. Others saw them as living gods, creatures imbued with the very essence of the earth, capable of reshaping civilization. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some believed the wilds were an ancient form of punishment, a divine judgment upon humankind for their exploitation of the planet. Others argued that the wilds were a harbinger of a new era, an age where humanity would be forced to submit to the natural forces of the earth. But amidst all the political chaos, one truth emerged. The wilds were spreading. The borders of the affected regions were growing. The Ashfall Wilds were no longer contained. And with that, the fate of the world rested in the hands of those who had been changed. Elara, standing at the edge of a towering cliff, watched as the wilds stretched out before her. An endless expanse of fire, ash, and lava. She could hear the hum in the distance, the beating pulse of the earth that had once been so distant, so foreign. But now it was a part of her. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat rise around her, the land shifting, alive beneath her feet. The wilds weren't just a place. They were a living organism, a force that had existed since the dawn of time, and now it was evolving. The earth was awakening, calling to its children, and it was time for humanity to face the truth. We were never meant to control this, she whispered to herself. We were always meant to become it. Elara's power surged, and the volcanoes erupted, spewing ash into the sky. The ground trembled beneath her feet, but she was unafraid. She could feel the transformation happening, not just to her, but to the earth itself. Humanity would either adapt or be swallowed whole. Mira's decision was the hardest. She stood on the edge of the wilds, torn between the human world and the land that had reshaped her. There were voices calling to her now, voices of the land, of the creatures, of the earth itself. It wasn't just the wilds calling her. It was the pulse of life, the heartbeat of the planet. Mira could feel it. If she stayed, the wilds would take her completely. But there was another way. She could warn the world, tell them the truth of what was happening. She could still act as a bridge between the old world and the new, a mediator between humanity and the power of the earth. But the decision was made for her. The wilds were no longer an option to resist. They were inevitable. Mira took a final breath, stepped forward, and entered the heart of the wilds. There would be no turning back. The world watched, paralyzed by the unknown. The survivors, changed beyond recognition, were now a part of the wilds. And as they did, the earth continued to shift. The world as humanity had known it was ending. The new dawn was rising.